We've already of course talked in Gran Turismo 7 about the road-going version of the Genesis G70 and the Gr3 version as well. Now it's time to round out the loop with the Gr4, and to be honest, I hadn't really used this car before. You can kind of see that from the mileage at the bottom of the screen, and I can't say I'd seen a huge amount of people using it online either, back when I did in particular my multi-part series for getting the 50 race finishes in sport mode. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't be necessarily a good car under the right circumstances. On paper, it has a bit of a mix. It's not as straightforward and obvious as a Gr3, which you pretty much know what you're getting into most of the time. They have a similar amount of power when fully upgraded. The weight doesn't tend to vary too much on those cars. There's some, but it's not crazy, especially on the more modern stuff. In Gr4 though, sometimes it feels like a bit of a free-for-all. You've got front-wheel drive, four-wheel drive, high weight, low weight, tiny cars, massive cars. You've got Veyrons in with Alpha 4Cs, in with something like this, in with older vehicles like the Alpha 155 touring car. It's a bit of a free-for-all, and of course when balance of performance comes in, much of that will change. So in the case of a car like this, where the immediate potential advantage jumps out at you, which is four-wheel drive, which can really come in handy, but then you've got a couple of potential disadvantages at the same time. For example, it's fairly long by Gr4 standards, being a four-door saloon, and also crucially, it weighs 1,400 kilos, which although not necessarily breaking the bank, especially with four-wheel drive, that is heftier than some. Now like I said, balance of performance can definitely change that. Fully upgraded with the higher RPM turbo, you're looking at around, I think it was 545 horsepower, somewhere around there, a little bit less with the mid-range, around 530. Of course, in online lobbies, that's not going to mean too much if balance of performance is applied, and in terms of standard numbers, you're looking at 414 horsepower stock. So much like the C5 Corvette, which I talked about in Gran Turismo 6 again recently, this car has an obsession with the number 4. There's 4s all over the place. It is of course turbo aspirated as well, pretty obviously front engine with that four-wheel drive. So the first question is, what's it like in practice? Well, wildly different to the Gr3, that's for sure. I personally like the Gr3, I like the way it looks. I've got mine in Vault-Tec livery, like Fallout style. I like the way it handles and the way it performs on its own at least, but then when I tried to use it online, I never really had much success with the car. It felt a bit too big, a bit too cumbersome. It just didn't really quite feel on pace with the other vehicles, and that could just be a me thing. Of course, certain cars will suit different people. This one, as you'll see here against Sophie, which of course better than normal AI but still not as quick as many real players, it can still definitely take the pace to any of them. In Gr4 though, I would argue more so than probably any other racing category, certainly any other racing category in this game, it really is where something like front-wheel drive can come in handy. Something like an Audi TT, a Peugeot RCZ, that's so quick through corners because it allows the car to almost have a bit of a buff in terms of balance of performance bias in its favour, because the weight is naturally lower anyway, and the horsepower doesn't necessarily need to be quite as good, because on the one hand you don't want torque steer, but then what power you do have, you can really pile on corner exit, which can really help, even on high-speed track. The one time where it really can come in handy though is bad weather. That is a very specific time to use it, so even then you're going to be really dependent on if the career mode event has weather, or if the online lobby is going to have rain, for example, etc. So it's a very niche thing to have that one potential advantage in. That being said, absolutely don't get me wrong, this is a great car to drive. I love the handling on this thing, and one of the great things about the way it's set up is that even with 1,400 kilos, even with no power advantage, I literally haven't done anything at all to this car. It's totally standard, straight out of the dealership. It's great to work with. The turn-in is also really good. The centre split on the diff feels very nicely set up, where it's nowhere near heavy on the front end. You can get a nice turn-in. It really does feel nicely balanced. And again, this is another example where I've got to say, as fictional, of course, as this particular version is, I have so much respect for what both Hyundai and Genesis are doing more recently. They're getting fantastic performance cars onto the market, even electric stuff with the iconic models, the N models, and then for Genesis with stuff like this. I believe recently, if I recall correctly, the Genesis road-going version has announced like a partnership with the Nürburgring or something like that to have a fleet of taxis to take people around. So it's great to see them being like fully accepted and embraced as this performance-oriented brand when they do decide to put that performance into a car. And not only that they're trying to do it, but that they are majorly succeeding. think they are great cars. And in the game, they certainly treat the Genesis in all of its forms with a pretty good amount of respect. Ironically, the least effective version is the fastest one, the Gr3. This one, I think, has definitely a mix of all-round potential, which could make it a good choice to go for. It does remind me a little bit of the Alfa 155. A lot of that, of course, comes from the four-wheel drive, but ultimately, I feel like this is one of those cars where if you were forced to have one vehicle to represent an entire swath of events in different circumstances, different balance of performance, different weather, then it's a pretty good all-rounder. But I feel that at the same time, the length of the car, the sheer size of it, the weight, which I will say it doesn't feel like a 1400 kilo car, I would guess it feels more like maybe 1250, which is pretty good to feel like that instead. But even so, it's just a fact that smaller, lighter cars are going to be more nimble. That's just the way it is. This has elements of Nissan GT-R in there in terms of its manners and its handling and how forgiving the car feels, but not necessarily quite as OP as a GT-R would be. I would love to hear though from those who have, pioneered this car online. Maybe you found it to be a really good thing, maybe you found it to be a particularly bad one on certain events or for certain reasons. So it could be great, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be that way, at least once balance of performance sets in. And from that perspective, that kind of reminds me a little bit of the Veyron. I really love the Veyron as an idea, but it's such an underpowered, relatively heavy car that it kind of feels a bit awkward in Group 4. That's it for my thoughts though. I'd love to hear yours, like I said, and of course stick around in future for more Gran Turismo 7 content. But for now, thanks for watching.